One night, when Paul was in bed, half asleep, the sudden germ of an idea for a children's song came about. Yellow Submarine is speculated to have been inspired by Bob Dylan's March Tempo Rainy Day Women No. 12 and 35, which entered the UK chart 2 weeks before. The Beatles met Dylan at the Savoy Hotel the evening before Paul wrote the song, where they also ran into Donovan, with whom they got on well. The next day, Paul stopped at Donovan's apartment and played him Yellow Submarine, asking for a suggestion for the closing lines. Donovan obliged with Sky of Blue, Sea of Green. The song's authorship was discussed during an interview in March 20th, 1967, with Brian Matthew at EMI Studios. Matthew addressed John. "Earlier before we started recording, you said Yellow Submarine was in fact written as two separate songs." John confirmed. "Yeah, I seem to remember, like, the submarine, the chorus bit, you coming in with it," to which Paul agreed, "Yeah." John then asked Paul, "And wasn't the other bit something that I had already going and we put them together?" Paul answered, Yeah, right, yeah." John then added, "And it makes sense to make it into with Ringo in mind." So there it is. Paul wrote the chorus and John wrote the verse, so it's entirely 50-50 Lennon-McCartney. An early demo by John, recorded around March 66, features the recognizable verse melody and chords, but in 3/4 time. It includes the lyrics, "In the town where I was born, no one cared, no one cared." This seems to be the initial form of what later became the verse in Yellow Submarine. Paul remembers, "I was laying in bed in the Ashes garret, and there's a nice twilight zone just as you're drifting into sleep and as you wake from it. I always find it quite a comfortable zone. You're almost asleep, and there's this little limbo-land just before you slip into sleep." I remember thinking that a children's song would be quite a good idea, and I thought of images, and the color yellow came to me, and a submarine came to me, and I thought, well, that's kind of nice, like a toy, very childish yellow submarine.
We will always be friends.
Promise? Promise?
It's a promise. Goodbye now. Goodbye.
I was thinking of it as a song for Ringo, which it eventually turned out to be, so I wrote it as not too rangy in the vocal. I just made up a little tune in my head, then started making a story, sort of an ancient mariner, telling the young kids where he'd live and how there'd been a place where he had a yellow submarine. I quite like children's things. I like children's minds and imagination, so it didn't seem uncool to me to have a pretty surreal idea that was also a children's idea. I thought also, with Ringo being so good with children, a knockabout uncle type, it might not be a bad idea for him to have a children's song rather than a very serious song.
What's worth doing is worth doing well, I say.
There was a lot of excitement, likely boosted by some chemical influences, during the recording of Yellow Submarine, with considerable effort put into perfecting it. Their friends were even brought in to help with the recording process. The same day Paul showed the new composition to Donovan, the boys went into EMI Studio 3 on May 26th, and after much rehearsal, they taped a rhythm track with vocals. Engineer Jeff Emmerich remembers about this day. George Martin was out sick with food poisoning. He sent his secretary and future wife Judy along to keep an eye on things, and I suppose to make sure we all behaved ourselves. She sat in George's place at the console making sure that the Beatles got everything they wanted, while I took the helm. George Martin's absence clearly had a liberating effect on the four Beatles. They behaved like a bunch of schoolboys with a substitute teacher filling in.
"It looks like supercars getting out of control, Troy."
I will be pleased to see the Earthmen disintegrated.
As a result, there was a lot of clowning around that evening, silliness that Martin would not have tolerated, and so rehearsals took a lot more time than the session itself. When Paul first ran the song down on piano, it sounded to my ears more like a children's song than a pop track, but everyone was enthused and got down to work. Paul reveals, "There were funny little grammatical jokes we used to play. It should have been, every one of us has all he needs, but Ringo turned it to, every one of us has all we need. So that became the lyric. It's wrong, but it's great. We used to love that." They then returned a week later in June 1st to throw a party in Studio 2 and overdub sound effects. After that first night of working on Yellow Submarine, The Revolver sessions were suspended for nearly a week because of George Martin's illness. Jeff Emerick comments, "When we finally returned to the studio, a recovered George was back in the producer's chair. But despite his return, that was the day the lunatics really took over the asylum," John stated. "We virtually made the track come alive in the studio." With George Martin now available, drawing from his experience as a producer of comedy records, they explored EMI's strap room for noise-making gadgets like chains, whistles, hooters, hoses, handbells, and an old tin bath. John, in his element, filled a bucket with water and blew bubbles in it while the band's chauffeur, Alf Bignell, rattled chains in the bath. Additional effects were sourced from old records, including a brass band march snippet that George Martin cleverly spliced into the last 2 bars of the second verse. For the middle section, John and Paul stepped into the studio's echo chamber to shout random nautical phrases. Once this was finished, it was time for a break. The Beatles joined some famous friends for dinner who had been specially invited. Emerick recalls, "Paul had conceived Yellow Submarine as a sing-along, and so a few of the band's friends and significant others had been invited along for the evening session. By then, everyone was distinctly in a party mood." Following a long dinner break, during which we suspected more than food was being ingested, a raucous group began filtering in, including Mick Jagger and Brian Jones, along with Marianne Faithfull and George's wife, Patty. Phil McDonald and I put a few ambient microphones around the studio, and I decided to also give everyone a handheld mic so they could move around freely. There was no way I was going to try to contain that lot. The whole marijuana-influenced scene that evening was completely zany, straight out of a Marx Brothers movie. In total, this process took nearly 12 hours, time well spent to produce this unique and sparkling novelty song.
Do you worry more now than you used to?
No, it's just who I am, maybe, you know. For instance, when we were now famous with the Beatles, and we had done Revolver, one of the early Beatles records, and I got the horrors one day. I thought it was out of tune. I thought the whole album was out of tune. I listened to it, and for some reason, just thought, oh my God. And I went to the guys. I said, "It's out of tune. I don't know what we're going to do, you know." And they said, and they got a bit worried, listened to it. They said, "No, it isn't.